right. Well, first I want to thank Peter and the whole DCU team for inviting me out. If nothing else, as the father of a 3-month-old, the 8-hour flight here, the red eye was probably the most sleep I've gotten in months. So I really appreciate that. But I want to start with this concept of the AI native tech transfer office, and it's building off of what Dr. Scanlon was talking about, AI first companies. It's this concept that we have, at least in San Francisco, of a dichotomy between companies that were built prior to this watershed moment in 2022, where large language models became a lot more accessible, right? And the thought process is, if you started building a company, day one, with access to these models as being ubiquitous, you would do things a lot differently than you might have done otherwise prior to AI, right? And from my experience, having worked with about 100 tech transfer offices now, kind of bringing in AI technology, we've seen the same thing, which is that if you were to look at tech transfer, look at the process from cradle to grave, from the moment an idea is conceived till you find a way to kind of get that in the market, you would probably think about those processes a little bit different today, having heard everything that we've heard, knowing what's out there, knowing what's coming, kind of knowing what you can do with agents. And that's really important because obviously I'm an advocate for AI. We try to bring AI into organizations, but for all the times we've done that and seen it drive impact, we've also seen it fail. And when it does, it's because people get really excited and enticed by kind of the flashiness of AI and think that, well, I can bring in an AI tool, but I can do that and not change kind of the process or how I work or how my team works. And that is really where I think we see a lot of failures, which is, we bring in the AI and we don't do things differently, and maybe we get marginal benefit off of that. And so, what I want to try to share today is a little bit of what I've seen kind of working with these tech transfer offices, not around specific features or kind of, what you might be able to do, but how you might have different processes, different approaches to some of kind of the endemic problems in tech transfer now that we have access to AI. So I want to start with the problems. And I also want this to be as conversational as possible, if for nothing else to keep me awake from the jet lag. So I know I'm standing between you and lunch. If you want to jump in and ask a question, just stand up. We don't need the microphone. And tell me why I'm wrong, why context is different in the Irish ecosystem. But tech transfer, at least from what I've seen, has always been difficult. There's always been a set of kind of institutional hurdles that make this difficult. I've never talked to a tech transfer office that felt they had too many resources, too many people, right? You're always bandwidth constrained. And it's getting harder though. So one of the things, we talk about AI as being this incredible value creator and accelerant, but it cuts both ways. What we're seeing is that it is shortening development cycles significantly. It is meaning that more innovation is getting created. It's also interesting, we work with a lot of companies as well, developing IP. It means that the places where IP and innovation is coming from within an organization is actually changing. The people who are developing commercializable technology are different than they were 3 or 4 years ago. In the corporate space, we're seeing marketing teams developing IP. We're seeing strategy and corporate development teams developing IP. And so how do you think about that as a tech transfer office? The typical centers of gravity within a research institution where you would kind of do your daily walks to meet professors, those are changing and shifting. So how do you think about that? And then the last thing, and it's been really interesting kind of being here talking with directors of tech transfer offices about the importance of spin-outs in the startup ecosystem. And I think in a way you're almost ahead of the US in that sense, in terms of focusing on that as a channel. But what we're starting to see in the US at least is that the outcomes for these spin-outs are falling short. There's been a lot of data collected on the volume of startup creation. But now that some of those startups have been around for 5-10 years, universities are starting to look at the data and realize, well, whether from a financial standpoint or even just an impact standpoint, not all of those startups are really driving the impact that you might want. So that's kind of the place in which we find ourselves right now. So the question is, what are some of the strategies that, at least in my experience, we've seen tech transfer offices start to adopt, kind of to change the way that they act, kind of thinking about these kind of endemic challenges. And then we can talk a little bit about how AI fits into that. So I think one of the most interesting things that I've seen is around this shift from reactive invention collection to proactive. And it's something that gets me really excited. It's thinking about, instead of just kind of listening and waiting for folks to come to us, how do we actually find and engage the best researchers and actually pick winners and engage them not only when they have IP, but before that IP is generated, and think about how we do that. The second thing is, how do we front load the research and analysis that goes into making better decisions? I think in my experience, before or after AI, one of the most important things about effectively commercializing technology is picking winners, right? We're always bandwidth constrained, and this is the hardest thing to do, to be able to focus your time on technologies that might actually drive outcomes. And so when I see offices that do this really well, they are starting on day one and evaluating technologies. They're not passively making decisions based on kind of the loudest PIs or where kind of the market is going. They are making educated bets based on well-informed, well-researched decisions. What we're seeing is this attitude around customer discovery being prime. So whether you're looking at licensing to big companies as the channel for commercialization, whether you're looking at spin-outs, being able to go to industry and talk to people, get people on the phone, do the legwork, that is incredibly impactful. And again, I'm sure I'm not talking about anything that's particularly novel here, but these are strategies that maybe we've always known about, that we haven't necessarily had the bandwidth or the luxury of pursuing. And as we kind of dive in, these are areas where I think AI actually does really free us up. And then the final thing, and this gets interesting in an ecosystem like Ireland, is strength in numbers. So the ability to not just market single technologies. In the US, we've seen universities kind of pivot towards a capability-first approach. So not thinking about, how do I license this one water filtration technology, but how do I talk about the membrane research that our researchers are doing writ large? Where this gets even more interesting in this context is, how do we think about what capabilities the Irish research landscape has writ large? How do we collaborate? How do we share what's happening at Cork and Limerick and find some sort of 1 + 1 that equals 3? This is an area where AI actually can really help us. So with kind of framing what these strategies are that I've seen offices kind of implement and be successful, I'll talk a little bit about kind of how AI fits in there. And I also want to hear other people's experience as well. But I want to start with proactive invention collection. I think this is kind of probably the most interesting piece for me. Everything starts with the idea, right? And too many times I see tech transfer offices that fail to commercialize the technology because they didn't collect enough information. That first interaction with the researcher didn't yield enough information, and you're kind of handicapped from the start. And AI really kind of creates this imperative to do things differently, right? I could tell you that some of the most innovative universities in the US are proactively finding PIs by looking at grants. And then that probably makes intuitive sense. But historically, who has time to look through every grant proposal that comes through the university, right? Every grant award. Well, this is something that AI does an incredible job at. We can actually feed grant awards into AI and proactively pull out where is their IP, and then actually start to do some triage there. And so that enables us to very, very quickly pick some winners and go to PIs who are working in areas that we think are impactful. Even if we don't have bandwidth for that, you talk about trying to create like very powerful KPIs around the invention disclosure experience. I don't know a lot of PIs who are really thrilled with filling out a 10-page form, right? This is the reason why half the invention disclosures you get say see attached, and it's a 30-page paper, right? I truly think that universities should actually really implement kind of a net promoter score, have their faculty actually score them on what the experience looks like. And one of the things you can do with AI is actually create what we call a delightful experience. Like, how do you create those dopamine hits for researchers when they submit things and get them coming back? And with AI, you can actually have them drop in a document and immediately kind of suggest some areas where you could use that technology. You could suggest, what are the most novel aspects? And from my experience, when you give faculty members information back, assuming it's well-resourced, it's cited, then you really have them hooked. And so that's an area where I think there's just a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit with AI. And I've seen universities implement this in a way that increases the quantity of disclosures, but almost more importantly, increases the quality of disclosures. It puts you in the driver's seat, helps you actually pick where you want to go and harvest disclosures, and do that in a way that's going to kind of vector you towards success. I'll share one more example that's probably further than you would ever take this, but it's just as a thought experiment. We actually work with some of the foundational model creators, and they have their AI, whether it's Claude at Anthropic or GPT, living in every company document. And so they have extended their tech transfer or IP team to the document level. And so the moment a researcher types a sentence that could have IP in it, they're acknowledging that, they're pulling that out to the IP team, running research reports on it, and then going back to the researcher within an hour saying, we think you have something. Something to think about. I think that's probably an extreme example. But I want to pause there. So talking about proactive invention disclosure, does that generally make sense? And is that something that you're seeing there being benefits of? And any questions about kind of how AI can factor into that process? Yeah. That's a really good question. I don't have great data to show which is more IP rich. I think grant proposals typically aren't particularly IP rich in that they're not proposing us, an answer yet. But what you can do is you can actually predict where IP is going to come. But to answer your question, again, we work with the University of Texas at Austin, and they had us, they went around to a conference where they had their postdocs presenting posters. They took pictures of all the posters and fed them into our system to identify IP. And the amount of potential IP that was there, now already publicly disclosed, of course, because it was in a poster, was incredibly significant. So I would say there probably is more actual IP, for better or for worse, in some of these poster presentations. But what grant proposals will do is vector you in the direction of opportunity and let you engage with that PI when they have funding, maybe push them in the right direction. Yeah?
So you can generate a large quantity of opportunities, but how do you rank the quality? Still a lot of information.
It is, which very conveniently brings me to my next point. It's nice to have a couple plants in the audience. So it's all about prioritization, honestly. And this, again, isn't a surprise to anybody. But a number of offices that I talk to don't have the resourcing to really go deep on all of those opportunities that you surface. Let's say you run every grant proposal through AI, you come up with 150 different vectors of innovation potentially, right? You just don't have the bandwidth to do that. And so where AI I think can be very effective is taking the place of a postdoc or an intern, somebody who could kind of do basic research for you. And so what we found is that you can look at those innovations, you can identify use cases for them pretty reliably. You can look at those use cases and you can understand the market pretty well. You can get general market size growth, you can source reports on the market, you can identify companies that are active in that space, products that those companies have. You can do prior art searching to understand just how novel they are. And you can do a little bit of technical due diligence as well. You can look at that idea and you can understand what would some of the barriers be to commercializing this. It is essentially enough, I think, to make a very initial go, no-go decision. And the idea is if you go from 150 innovation vectors down to maybe 10 that are particularly exciting based on the AI research, that's where you put a human on that, right? And have them go a little bit deeper, maybe talk to the inventor. So that's where I think there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity for streamlining there. I think this is also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, like where there are downfalls or challenges around AI. If you're going to take that research and go back to a PhD and say, well, we're not going to prioritize, this innovation. You better be right, and you better be well cited. And so a lot of the AI solutions out there, I think, don't necessarily have the level of repeatability. And so this is an area where I think finding a way to have guardrails, having a solution that is repeatable, is cited, is well sourced, that's important. And that's not what you might necessarily get from just a subscription to GPT. All right. So the next piece is customer discovery. Again, none of this is rocket science, right? We've always known that the best outcomes come from actually talking to industry and figuring out, where can you commercialize. But again, who has the time to actually go out and conduct extensive, exhaustive customer research? A lot of times, when we work with universities in the US that have spin-out programs, they're pushing this onto the entrepreneurs, as you should. But a lot of times we're seeing universities actually hold their hand a little bit and help them and actually use customer discovery as a gate for any type of kind of funding or accelerator programs. And so where AI, I think, can be very helpful here is, how do you take, every source of information on the internet, whether that's company pages, FCC filings, whether it's looking at academic publications, research publications, how do you boil through all of that and quickly find kind of at least a short example of the right customer set? Because from my experience, and we've had to do a lot of customer discovery, getting people to pick up the phone and answer you is a factor of talking to the right person at the right company at the right time with the right message, right? You have to have all these things align. And AI actually can really help you with that because these models are connected now to the internet. And so we can very quickly find the right companies. We can then go through and say, well, based on what these companies are doing, is there any imperative for them to talk to you now? Has one of them just raised a round of funding? Has one of them just gone through a strategic M&A? And then we can look through all of the people who work at those companies very quickly, and we can actually find the right person and potentially even get their contact information. And then lastly, we can generate outreach, right? So we can very quickly kind of put together a coherent message for that company, right? It's not just a coherent message about the technology, but it's tailoring that to each company. And that's an area where you just don't have the bandwidth otherwise. So being able to very quickly put together an outreach strategy using AI, generating your talking points, it's incredibly effective there. And then the last piece is putting it on the marketplace. So I've always been a proponent of proactivity, right? You need to reach out to people. If you just stick a technology on a marketplace, it's likely not going to get licensed. But almost counter to that, one of the things that I've seen is that we've started to crunch the data, and universities that have a higher percentage of their IP public and available for searching, so on some sort of a coherent marketplace, actually license at a higher rate. And we're really kind of trying to dig into why that's happening. Is that causation? Is it just correlation? But it seems to be the case pretty significantly in the data. And so the only thing I can kind of take away from that is if you can build enough pull with kind of the whole corpus of innovation, and if you can communicate about that innovation, not on a technology specific factor, but if you can talk about capabilities. We're actually seeing the US national labs do this very, very well. They've struggled because I think there's a lot of skepticism around industry. Do we want to license a technology from Los Alamos? Because the labs aren't known as being particularly good at commercializing. But when you can kind of take their technology as a whole and say, well, this lab is incredibly good at doing research on quantum encryption. And so when I have a problem in this space, I want to talk to them. That's been impactful. And if you can kind of get all of your technologies out into the world and tell that story, then you have a really good chance of doing that. But the problem being, who has the time to put all of their technologies up? How do we generate non-confidential summaries at a high enough quality? And again, this is a task I think AI does really well. We had the opportunity to work with MIT's Lincoln Labs on this, and they had a backlog of about 500 technologies. And so we ran it through the AI, and they spot checked, 1 in every 5, and then 1 in every 20, eventually 1 in every 50. And it got to the point where AI was good enough to talk about these technologies in a way that was repeatable and could get industry interested. Now think about doing this kind of on a whole of Ireland level, right? What if we could paint a picture for Irish businesses and multinational corporations? What are the capabilities across the Irish research landscape? What if somebody comes in and looks at a technology developed at DCU and then stumbles upon something that solves a problem that came out of Limerick, right? All of a sudden you get network effects that become incredibly impactful. And so something to think about, I think. But I know we're almost at time. It's close to lunch, so I'm going to pause again and just see if anybody has any questions about this. Whether it's these strategies specific to AI. We of course use a lot of AI in our company. Happy to answer model questions, but I'll leave it to you.
Alec, I have actually one related to this. Last night you'd mentioned it was kind of two different scenarios in this kind of pooling of IP. One was, I believe, Sunny, where
Yes.
you got multiple campuses that were integrated, but you had another one, maybe one of the Carolinas, where you pulled together clusters of smaller universities that didn't have critical mass. On the Carolinas one, can you talk a little bit more about that, how it worked, what the outcomes were, or is there data to show yet that shows this theory of the kind of strength in numbers starts to work at a regional, if not at the international level?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. So
Could you repeat the question? Because I think it was a little
yes.
bit low.
So the question was, have we seen examples of bundling that's worked at some sort of a regional or a national level? And at the U.S. at least, we work at the state level quite a bit. And so at a state like North Carolina, you have a center of excellence in the research triangle, right? You have University of North Carolina, Duke, a couple others. And then you have about 20 universities across the state that are doing interesting innovation. Some of them have tech transfer offices, some of them don't. But what we're able to see is that once we built this marketplace that created a center of gravity, the number of licenses that involved multiple parties went up. Of course, that was contingent on having a standardized licensing agreement that you could get the parties to agree with. It actually was pretty easy in North Carolina because the funding organization, because they were paying for the universities to have this capability, they were kind of able to dictate and say, this is the funding agreement we're going to use. So there wasn't as much kind of horse trading between the universities. But we saw the number of those agreements go up. And then interestingly enough, we just saw the number of industry touches at each of these smaller universities go up by about 40%. And what was really interesting is these were non-proactive touches. These were industry contacts coming in that otherwise just wouldn't have come in. So it's been pretty impactful. Yeah.
We have time for one more question before lunch.
Hi, mine's not so much a question, more a comment. You talked about the customer discovery, and that's really impactful. We've heard from Patricia about the traction. Yes, probably AI could give you some summary, but there is no substitute for getting in front of the customer, as you said, talking to as many of those. I know from experience being a commercial consultant, it's like AI is not going to give you the body language, the enthusiasm, the words that someone will mention as to how excited they want something, whether they wanted it yesterday or it's really a nice to have. That's what I'd say, just to be careful for using it for that. And also, because it is so important, the funding around that for the commercial consultants probably needs to be looked at from EI, because many of them have left that market. Can I pass to my colleague also from University of Limerick who has a question?
Just really quickly too, I would completely agree with you. And in fact, I think the real value of AI, if we talk about AI as an accelerant, is to reduce the amount of administrative work and kind of busy work and actually empower tech transfer leaders to spend more time on what I think are the two most important points. It's building relationships with the inventor community and building relationships with industry. And so what AI can do is maybe tear down some of those barriers for finding the right people to talk to and getting in front of them, but you still need a person to get in front of them and to understand. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, back to a kind of a more technical question, really. But I guess the holy grail would really be being able to mine, say, patent data. Like, I mean, I can look at DCU's patent portfolio. Anyone could look at Limeric's or whatever. But patents are very, very poor sales tools because they're unintelligible and
Yes.
written that way.
By definition.
Yeah, by definition, yeah. And then, but you also have the bank of publications that may be associated with it. And I've yet to see, and because I've messed around with it, and maybe I just need to wait till another month and AI will be able to do it. I don't know. But have you had any success in mining patent portfolios, being able to articulate what they are, auto bundling where there are similarities, and almost be able to generate a portfolio or generate a flyer from something as stale as a patent and potentially related publications, because the inventors are named there, the publication should be mineable as well, related. Have you done any activity in that area or had any success in that area?
This is actually a really critical point, and I'm going to try to not make this a advertisement for trade space. So what I'll say is this is an area where I think there's a benefit to having enterprise-wide platforms as opposed to just using a GPT instance. And the benefit is the data. And so I think I said this at the beginning, tech transfer starts with the invention disclosure, the quality of the information and the context you get from the inventor on day one. And so if you have a system that is accurately and comprehensively capturing all of that context on new ideas as they're generated and correlating all that unstructured data, grant proposals, invention disclosures, papers, publications, all the way up to patents, you can tell a really compelling story and you can give an AI model all of that context or even just some of that context. And you can get a really, really well-reasoned, thoughtful answer. We've seen organizations go as far as, again, if you're able to capture conversations with inventors, recording them, that becomes an input alongside the patent that helps you really meaningfully improve the quality. So it's doable. I think having AI, just look at a patent, it's going to do a better job than a person, but the more context you give these models, the better. So if you can have a system that has access to a whole lot of data from your organization, then there's really no limit to what's possible.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think a round of applause.